Ellen, how important would it be if the Saudis did indeed start selling substantial numbers of barrels of oil to the Chinese in a currency other than dollars?
Well, I really don't think that we're looking at substantial number of barrels of oil that it's possible for them to really sell in yuan, because what are the Saudis going to do with yuan? Aramco, we have to remember, Aramco is the one that's selling the oil, and Aramco does its business in dollars. They're not going to be able to pay their dividends, their taxes necessarily to the Saudi government in yuan. So I don't think that we're talking about a substantial amount here, but it wouldn't surprise me if they do sell some amount in yuan, because, for example, that may be what the Chinese want, but also to keep their foot in the Chinese market here, because there's always a potential for China to shift to buying more oil from Russia. They'd have to use this yuan to basically pay for, Chinese contractors or projects that they're doing in China, which they have, but it's not substantial enough for them to be able to say accept all of their payments from China in yuan.
And I think the rough math would suggest that China buys 25% or more of the Saudi exports. Obviously, the oil market, Ellen, was also watching the latest on COVID in China just to try to gauge the demand story. I wonder how closely you're watching any updates on COVID restrictions or lockdowns, just depending on how things play out on that front when you're trying to figure out the math of oil going forward.
Yeah, this is definitely a concern because, if the lockdown spread, then it could significantly impact Chinese demand. And we've seen this happen before. The question is also, though, will it affect demand in other parts of Asia? That could also be a calculus. And we did see oil drop, 8% yesterday and earlier this week. So it's definitely a major calculus. The other question is, will Chinese concerns affect other countries? And we are starting to see some rumblings of this from the United States, at the very least. I'm not convinced that this will lead to any kind of significant curbing of mobility, but it's definitely something to be aware of and to keep in mind, because it could affect Chinese demand.
Annmarie, what are we looking at in terms of the sanctions right now? They have been ratcheting up sanctions over the last few weeks, and especially in regards to Russian oil, Russian gas. I mean, this is their main source of funding, as Volodymyr Zelensky pointed out to the German Bundestag.
Yeah, so I think you have to separate the two. When it comes to oil, we know what the United States is doing. They're banning Russian oil imports. Europe can't do that, and a lot of other countries around the world can't. Actually, India, there was reporting by Reuters, was looking to potentially buy some Russian Urals, their name of they are like thick crude, because it was priced so cheap compared to where you're seeing Brent and et cetera around $100 a barrel. Gas is another completely different topic, because when you go pick up oil, you got to send a tanker, and you're seeing potentially some shut-ins in Russia. Gas is still flowing. Nord Stream 1 continues. And Matt, you lived in Berlin. You know how important Russian natural gas is to heat homes in Germany and the rest of Europe.
And staying with that subject of energy flows, Ellen, I'll bring you back into the conversation. I guess another factor that we need to be watching is what happens with Iran. What can you tell us on what you'll watch for with any developments there?
Yeah, I think there's definitely the potential for some movement. It did seem earlier, last month, that there was a lot of optimism that we might actually see a deal before now. Clearly, we haven't gotten there. I do think that the increase in oil prices has made it more difficult for Iran to make concessions in these negotiations, because, frankly, they're making plenty of money off of high oil prices. They're selling petroleum products. They're selling more oil than they sold at certain times during the Trump administration. So they're definitely less willing to make concessions. The release of the British hostages was definitely promising, but I'm not convinced that that is necessarily heralding a deal. And until we have an actual deal, there's still a substantial number of barrels that Iran, that are kept off the market from Iran.
How concerning is the warning, Annmarie, from U.S. intelligence agencies that Putin could make a nuclear threat. I mean, it seems to me that as we pile on these sanctions, and the worse he does in Ukraine, the worse the Russian army does in Ukraine, and the harder hit his economy is, the more dangerous he is.
It does feel, given what is going on the ground in Ukraine, the actions on the ground, we should always look at these actions, right, instead of exactly what either Sergei Lavrov or President Putin says. We should look at the actions.
Rather than the words.
Yes, it signals that he's digging his heels in, and he's not going to back down. And this report from the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency talking about the fact that he's going to start brandishing nuclear weapons, and that speech he gave yesterday does signal that he is incredibly frustrated at the moment. And he even said to Russian people, besides the fact that he wants to rid Russia of what he calls traitors in his country, but also the fact that he said it's going to be hard. This inflation, these economic penalties are going to be very difficult for Russians. But we should note, he's already signaled and flirted with the idea of putting his nuclear arsenal
on higher alert.
Yes, on higher alert. So it's already started.